I'm Clay Hardwick, Director of the Reasonable Faith Chapter in Frankfort, Kentucky, which is a ministry focused on training Christians how to defend their faith. Reasonable Faith chapters seek to grow Christians through study and discussion of apologetic topics. Sometimes there's opportunities to have guest speakers come and talk about specific topics. Recently I had the opportunity to attend an event at UK, at the University of Kentucky, where Jim Wallace spoke on the reliability of the New Testament. I wanted to give you a little background in advance of my interview with Jim. His first book, Cold Case Christianity, Homicide Detective Investigates the Claims of the Gospels, just came out in January. It's endorsed by well-known authors and pastors like Rick Warren and Josh McDowell. Lee Strobel, you've probably heard of him, did the foreword. I think Jim provides a really unique perspective with his training as a detective. You could say he's really experienced and highly trained in how to examine evidence. And in the book, I think he did a great job of acquainting his readers with some of the key principles involved in being a detective. He actually invites the reader to take on the role of being a juror and then examine the evidence of the claims made by the eyewitnesses in the events of Jesus' life. Recently, some of my friends and I, we went through the book, and we all really enjoyed learning the basic principles of how to evaluate the evidence as it pertains to cold case homicides, and then using those principles in the evaluation of the New Testament Gospels. So during Jim's visit, I was able to sit down with him and ask him some questions relative to Christian history and apologetics. All right. Well, I'm here today with Jim Warner Wallace. He's got a podcast and a blog, Please Convince Me, and I'm going to discuss some things with him about just early Christianity, and just going to go through a few questions and stuff, and he'll just kind of tell us about that and everything. So I've got a few questions lined up for you, Jim.
Okay.
Some things I wanted to kind of talk about as far as early Christianity goes. I mean, in our day and time, we rely a lot on historians translating the New Testament manuscripts to make the most sense of what was communicated about the gospel in the first century. But what would it have been like if you were a first century Christian? What would a person have come across if they were living back in that time? You know, they didn't have they didn't really have any kind of manuscript yet.
Right.
So what was circulating?
Well, I wouldn't expect if we had an event, any event in time that was of critical importance. So I work homicides, and I can tell you that most people who witness a homicide don't necessarily write down what they saw. As a matter of fact, there are times when they don't even tell anybody about it, or they don't even know the power of what they've seen for many years. And then we come along years later and we find these people and we interview them, and for the first time their testimony is now being captured, and it may be years after the event. I think there's good reason to suspect that the eyewitnesses of the life of Jesus really expected that he would return in their lifetime. And you see this in the writings of Paul, you see this in a lot of the letters in the New Testament, this expectation that Jesus is going to come back. And if that was the case, I would suspect that for the most part, as long as you have the living eyewitnesses, there would be no need for their written testimony. I think the written testimony becomes important if the eyewitnesses don't expect to make it out alive. When the eyewitnesses realized that they were going to die without the return of Christ, then I think you started to see, especially around the time of the first martyrdoms of Stephen and James, the brother of John, I think within 15 to 12, 15, 18 years of the actual events, we're starting to see the chronicling of the events, and for example in the Gospel of Mark. One of the things we try to talk about in the book is how reasonable is it to date the Gospels early? Is it reasonable for us to make a case that Luke, writing the book of Acts, is leaving significant portions of the book of the history out because they haven't occurred yet? He's not even familiar. So for example, why do we see no destruction of the temple, no siege of Jerusalem, the death of Paul, of James, the brother of Jesus, of Peter? Why are these things left unmentioned in a book that Luke seems to think it's important to mention the death of James, the brother of John? He mentions the death of Stephen. I think it's reasonable to infer that the reason why these other factors are missing is purely because of the fact it's been written too early. It's written probably in 60, maybe in the late 50s, and that would account for why the death of James, for example, in 61 AD is missing from the book of Acts. And if we start to date this backwards, I think we can actually make a strong case for dating the Gospel of Mark within a generation, within the first generation of eyewitnesses. And if that's the case, that's powerful evidence to me, as a skeptic it was, because I always suspected that the story of Jesus somehow got distorted. But if you were really there and seeing it firsthand, I think what I would expect initially is oral transmission.
Yeah.
The same way any event occurs and witnesses said, would you believe what I just saw? And they speak it to the person they're talking to. Even today, with all the ways we can write things down, I'm not sure you'd see an article necessarily written if I can just tell you what I saw.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think it gets, for example, how many times do you see eyewitnesses of significant events that are interviewed by the press? Their interviews are captured on video, but these same witnesses don't go off and write stories about it, write books about it. They've already given their eyewitness testimony verbally. So I think this is what we were seeing in the first century. I think we were seeing that there was an expectation that I would communicate this with power as an eyewitness, along with others who would be testifying with me as eyewitnesses. It's only when the expectation was that they weren't going to make it before the return of Christ, they started to write these things down.
Yeah. We're coming up on Easter weekend here pretty soon now, and it's actually going to be this weekend. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times, I mean, there's shows on the History Channel, different things. You see people, the archaeologists get interviewed and stuff like that. And when we take that information in and we see kind of a skeptical analysis of that, I mean, is there anything really to be concerned about or worried about with that?
Every case anyone makes on either side, if it's a case for Christianity or a case against Christianity, every case probably has some virtues and some liabilities. That's just the nature of case making. So when I present a case, where I just had a case, for example, in which we presented the entire case and the jury came to a verdict, and then after the verdict, the suspect actually confessed to it. But when the verdict was rendered, there were still a number of skeptics. So here I had a case that I knew was true, and it proved to be true because he eventually confessed to it. But while it was being presented, it had a large number of liabilities, a large number of unanswered questions. And the fact that the case has liabilities does not mean that it is not true. And so I think that now what the defense tries to do is exploit the liabilities. That's fair. We're going to do the same thing in reverse with his case. So it's fair for us to try to exploit the liabilities on both sides. So I guess what I try to have is I have some evidential modesty, I think, about what it is I expect to find that would corroborate this. So for example, if we came into a case and a witness said that Clay reached over and pointed a gun at Jim and demanded money from him, and he had one hand on the table and one hand on the gun. And I went back and I wanted to corroborate that eyewitness statement. Well, one thing I could use to corroborate that eyewitness statement would be your fingerprints on the table. Because you told me that you used one hand on the table and one hand on the gun. Someone told me that, an eyewitness. So that evidence of the fingerprints would corroborate the eyewitness's statement. But here's the problem. All corroborative evidence only speaks to an aspect of the overall event. Okay. That tells me your hand was there, but it doesn't tell me anything about what you had in your other hand. It doesn't tell me anything about what you said to me. It doesn't tell me a lot of other details. Corroborative evidence tells you one small piece that then you extrapolate. So when we see the evidence for Christianity is corroborative, it's been corroborated by archaeology, don't be surprised that we're only going to see a fingerprint corroboration. A lot of other detail we're going to have to trust the eyewitness for. Because there is no, unless you have a videotape, and even if you had a videotape, you may not have all the audio, or might not have the right angle. There'll be something that's not corroborated. At some point, the corroborative evidence inclines you to believe the eyewitness testimony, but you come to trust the eyewitness testimony. That's what's happening here. We have to say, hey, is there some evidence that corroborates the claims of the New Testament and archaeology? Yes. Is it every detail? No. It's a fingerprint based on the whole case. Is there some evidence of first century authors that are non-Christians that corroborates some of the claims of Scripture? Yes. Does it corroborate every claim? No. It's a fingerprint. And we continue to see this kind of corroborative evidence. That's just the nature of this kind of evidence.
Sure.
So I think there's enough to corroborate, but at some point I've got to step off the other pieces of evidence and say, okay, now I'm going to have to trust the statements of the eyewitness. And that's what we do with the Gospels.
Okay. recently I was looking at your blog at Please Convince Me, and I found one of the blog entries kind of helpful. It was titled, "There's a difference between evidence and proof."
Yes.
And you talked about Bart Ehrman's reaction to textual variants, and then you went on to comment about how it isn't the Christian's place to prove the reliability of the New Testament, and then you went on to define proof and evidence. And I thought it might be good to just give us to just comment on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I just really enjoyed that.
Well, and I'm using terms that I'm defining.
Yeah.
So I'm not using classic philosophical terms for proof and evidence. I'm just using how I've observed evidence and proof in court trials. Okay. And what I've discovered is I can provide the evidence that I think is best inferred to a particular conclusion. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't mean that the jury is going to find that conclusive. It doesn't mean that I'm going to necessarily prove this to the jury. Mm-hmm. I present all the evidence. The defense does their job. Then whether or not I've proven something is a decision that's in the heart of the juror, in the mind of the juror. So I have to give this evidence, and they go off and they think about whether this actually proves something. So I'm usually a little bit more modest in my initial claims. I'm not going to say, I'm going to prove this to you. No. Instead, I would usually say, hey, I'm going to provide you with the evidence that was decisive for me. And I think it should be decisive for you. But whether or not it proves something to you personally is going to be based on a couple of other things as well. Not just the rational evidence in the room. It's going to also be based on your emotional reaction to that evidence, your volitional response to this evidence. There's more than just rational factors involved in this. So I think we have to understand that. I've had cases where I've seen cases where, in my case, I've been lucky so far. If I really think about going back, I'm trying to remember the last case that I felt like the jury did not come to the right conclusion for me personally. And I've been really, so far, had some great successes. But we're all familiar with cases where we thought for sure they're going to find that person guilty, and then they don't. And then when they're interviewing the jury afterwards and they're describing why it is they found him to be not guilty or found her to be not guilty, we thought to ourselves, my gosh, how did that thinking process? So there are times when other factors enter into a consideration that are not purely evidential. And when that happens, people come to conclusions that are not really justified by the evidence. Mm-hmm. So when I was a new examiner of the resurrection, I had to really ask myself this question. Am I resisting the conclusion that's offered by the apostles that this actually occurred? Am I resisting that because it's not evidentially sound? Or am I resisting it because I have a presupposition which excludes anything miraculous, anything supernatural? See, for me, a lot of it was that if it required the supernatural, I automatically dismissed it. Sure. And so I had a presupposition. And I wasn't being fair with the evidence. So I think for most of us who are examining evidence, it's a matter of us saying, hey, are we allowing our presuppositions, or are we letting the evidence speak for where our conclusions are? Sure. Now, I think that, yes, there's no doubt that our response to the resurrection has a liability. We have a liability. Here's the liability. Our explanation requires that the supernatural be possible. And for some people, that's a liability that's just too great.
Right.
And I understand that. I can actually understand, because that was my position for many years. I simply at some point had to say, well, is that it? If I'm open to the possibility of the miraculous, does this explanation then make the most sense of the evidence? Or is it really a matter of my shutting down that answer before I even begin?
Right. And you were kind of talking about the resurrection and everything, and I guess people have heard different things as far as arguments go, but I thought just your perspective as a detective, what might you, if you were talking to someone about the resurrection and just in conversation, what kind of things would you want to hit on if they've got a listening ear and they're not really, well, as you were just discussing, they're not really looking for full proof, then they're actually seeking. What would you like to tell them about that?
Well, in the end, all these events, many events, are made on two kinds of evidence: direct evidence and indirect evidence. And indirect evidence is sometimes called circumstantial. Okay. Direct evidence is typically limited to the testimony of witnesses. Okay. That's really what direct evidence comes down to. And one piece of direct evidence can be powerful. If you've got a witness who comes in and testifies to something, and you find that witness to be reliable, you consider that witness to be trustworthy, well, then that's really all you need is that one person's testimony in order for you to believe it. Okay. So if I've got a witness who saw the murder occur, and she's vetted in a number of ways, and she passes the test, and she's considered to be reliable, and she says, I saw him do it, Well, guess what? You probably have got a witness you can trust, and that might be all the jury needs, is that one piece of direct evidence. On the other hand, if you don't have an eyewitness, you have to make the case in a more complex way. That's more difficult, and that uses circumstantial evidence. I think the case for Christianity is built upon the eyewitness statements of the gospel writers. We have to ask ourselves, is this complete fiction? Is it a late fiction? Is it a distorted fiction? Is it a lie, a conspiracy? We've got to examine those eyewitnesses and put them to the test. And if we put them to the test the same way we would put any eyewitness to the test, and they seem to pass in every one of those areas that we would argue they ought to pass, what do we do with the testimony then? Do we say, well, okay, I'm still going to pick and choose between on this account and take out the stuff I don't like and leave in the stuff I do? Or do we say, look, we've vetted these guys. We find them to be reliable. Now we either have to take what they offer or reject what they offer. I don't think we have the choice, though. How would we discern between what we want to keep and what we want to dismiss? I think in the end we're stuck with eyewitness accounts that I think are reliable that describe the resurrection. And if that's the case, then at some point we have to at least be open to the possibility. By the way, if we begin by rejecting everything supernatural, we're never going to consider that resurrection. And so we're done before we start. But if we open up our minds to the possibility of the supernatural, then I think that the Christian response, the Christian explanation of the events, is the most reasonable inference.
Yeah. One final question, this is more kind of a pragmatic nature, I guess, just for people out there that'll be watching the video and stuff. A lot of Christians, I think they look at the field of apologetics and they just say, I'm thankful that we have guys like you out there that are doing blogs, writing books and podcasts and stuff. But and I'll just kind of stick with my I like singing in the choir. I like doing projects. I think that's good enough. I mean, is there any advice you might have? Any kind of thing you'd like to tell them?
Yeah, it's really doing this kind of work is interesting for me because I'm new to it, and I'm just sharing the kinds of things I've learned as a detective and how these things might impact your examination of historical events related to Jesus. And so I've done this work now for a little while. I'm always amazed. I don't expect. If you'd have talked to me at the age of 30, I would have still rejected much of what I've even offered today, because I was rejecting it volitionally. That's where I was. I mean, there was not enough room in my life for any God other than the God of Jim. So I mean, for the most part, that was where I stood, and I had a volitional resistance to the existence of God or anything supernatural, and. So if you'd have offered it to me, I expect people like me that back then to resist. What is harder, I think, is when you have folks who are already Christians, who are already believers, who would reject an approach that causes you to have to examine how evidence is used and do we have a good case for Christianity. And I understand that God does the work of calling His children home. And I've never denied that. Of course that's the case. I was at war with God for most of my adult life, and it wasn't until God did something to remove that enmity I had that I was able to see evidence fairly at all. But clearly, He used the evidence as a means by which to communicate this truth to me. And I think we're living in a world that is demanding this kind of an approach, demanding evidence. Why would you believe this is true? And if you have no more reason to believe this is true than a faithful adherent to any other religious worldview, then why not be a different worldview? Why be a Christian rather than a Mormon or a Buddhist or a Muslim? Why be this particular kind of religious believer? We've got to make a case not just for why the non-believing world should believe that God exists. We've got to make a case, I think, for why of all the religious worldviews, Christianity is actually the one that's true. And if we're going to make that case, I think we have to, at least at some point, learn how to make cases. And I think this is what Peter is saying to us in 1 Peter 3. I mean, we feel guilty all the time that we don't evangelize like we ought to. I mean, pastors are always telling us how we need to get out. And most of us know as Christians we ought to get out and share the good news. But we don't do it as often as we should. But Paul tells us in Ephesians 4 that some of you are evangelists and some of you are pastors and some of you are teachers, which clearly means that some of you aren't. So why are we feeling bad if not all of us are designed to be Billy Graham? Some of us are and some of us aren't. But we should feel bad, but that all of us aren't making a case, though, because Peter says in 1 Peter 3 that all of us ought to be ready to give an answer to those of us who ask us why we have this hope in Jesus. No one gets off the hook on that. You may not consider yourself called to be an evangelist or a pastor or a teacher, but you are called to be an apologist. And that's the thing and that's a terrible word, I know, but you're called to be a Christian case maker, to make a case for what you believe when somebody asks. And I think part of the problem is that most of us as Christians, when we're asked this question, why do you believe this to be true, we don't have an answer. And I can tell you, as a non-believer, I had a lot of cop friends who were investigators who did not have a good answer for that question. And I couldn't understand why these guys were investigators in their professional lives, but they weren't investigators in their spiritual lives.
Sure.
And that kept me at bay for a while. I realized, hey, if you can't take this approach to your spiritual life, that's not for me. If you want to be a robust thinker and a robust investigator, you don't have to hang that up in order to be a Christian. You can do that as a Christian because this is where you get a chance to examine the evidence and to dig deeply into what you believe. So I would just encourage everybody to take that extra step. Otherwise, I think you're living an abbreviated Christian life. You're living as a Christian when you were called to be a Christian case maker. And that's a different kind of Christian.
Yeah. Right. Well, thanks for taking time today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah,
and
of
appreciate you writing the book. I think it's been an inspiration to me and people in my church and stuff. And I hope that other people will read it because it's very much worth the time, and it will help you in being a good Christian case.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks.